So this is the third of 3 videos looking at percentages. If you haven't seen the other 2 videos, they are in the description below. But in this video, we're going to be looking at writing one amount as a percentage of another. So the objectives of this lesson is to use various non-calculator approaches to find one value as a percentage of another, use a calculator to find one value as a percentage of another, and to look at questions where the answer has to be given to 1 or 2 decimal places. The skills required is really knowing about simplifying fractions and writing equivalent fractions. Again, this is something that I have covered in a previous video, and there is a link in the description below. But let's begin with something that you probably are familiar with. A score of 7 out of 10 is given in a test. What is this as a percentage? Now you probably know the answer to this, but let's look at the mechanics of how to work out the percentage. A lot of the time when 7 out of 10 is given as a test score, it may be written as a fraction, 7 over 10. But how can we use this to help us determine what this is as a percentage? Remember that percent is something out of 100. So what we need to do is to convert this fraction into a fraction as something out of 100. So we need to write an equivalent fraction for 7 over 10. I know that 10 multiplied by 10 is equal to 100. So if I multiply the denominator by 10, I have to multiply the numerator by 10. And that gives us 70 over 100. And of course, 70 over 100 is 70%. So we would say that 7 is 70% of 10. And think of 10 as the 100%. This would also mean that 3 would be 30% of 10. Anyway, we're going to move forward and look at some approaches at finding the percentage of one amount to that of another. And we'll begin by drawing upon what we already know. We know that a half, for example, is 50%, a quarter is 25%, 3/4 is 75%, 1/10 is 10%, and 1/5 is 20%. Here are 4 questions that draw upon this information. What is 35% as a percentage of 70? Well, if we write this as a fraction, we end up with 35 over 70. And you're probably aware that 35 is half of 70. We can actually write 35 over 70 as an equivalent fraction of a half. And a half is, of course, 50%. So we would say that 35 is 50% of 70. What is 8 as a percentage of 32? Again, if we write this as a fraction, we have 8 over 32. And you are probably aware, because 8 goes into 32 4 times, that this fraction could be simplified to a quarter. And we know that a quarter is 25%. So we can say that 8 is 25% of 32. What is 9 as a percentage of 12? So let's write this as a fraction. We have 9 over 12. 3 goes into both 9 and 12. If we divide 9 by 3, we get 3. And if we divide 12 by 3, we get 4. So 9/12 can be simplified to 3/4, which of course is 75%. And so we can say that 9 is 75% of 12. Finally, we have what is 4 as a percentage of 20. So if we write this as a fraction, we have 4 over 20. And you're probably aware that 4 goes into 25 times. We can simplify 4/20ths to 1/5. And of course, 1/5 is 20%. So we can say that 4 is 20% of 20. I'm now going to look at some questions which revolve around multiples of 10. And what I mean by this is when we create the fraction from the problem, we end up with the denominator being a multiple of 10. I'll show you what I mean. What is 9 as a percentage of 10? So we write this as 9 over 10. Remember that when we write the two numbers as a fraction, ultimately we want to have a fraction that is something out of 100. And just like the first question we did with the test of 7 out of 10, if we multiply the denominator by 10, we get 100. And if we multiply the numerator by 10, we get 90. So we end up with 90 over 100, which of course is equal to 90%. So 9 is 90% of 10. What is 9 as a percentage of 20? So we have 9 over 20 as a fraction, and we want to turn this into something over 100. Well, if we multiply the denominator by 5, we end up with 100. Therefore, we have to multiply the numerator by 5. 9 multiplied by 5 is equal to 45. So we end up with 45%. So 9 is 45% of 20. What is 72 as a percentage of 90? Let's begin by writing this as a fraction. Now, it's not so clear about how to get from 72 over 90 to something over 100. But when you're dealing with a fraction where the denominator is a multiple of 10, which in this case is 90, the first thing we want to do is to write this fraction as something out of 10. 90 divided by 9 is equal to 10. And what I do to the bottom, I must also do to the top. So 72 divided by 9 is equal to 8. So we end up with 8 over 10. And I think you know where we're going to go from here. If we multiply the denominator and the numerator by 10, we end up with 80 over 100. And this, of course, is 80%. And we can write this as 72 is 80% of 90. What is 28 as a percentage of 40? So we've got 28 over 40. Again, it's not so easy to convert this into something out of 100. The first thing we can do, well, we want to write it as a fraction as something over 10. Well, 40 divided by 4 is equal to 10. What I do to the bottom, I must also do to the top. So 28 divided by 4 is equal to 7. So I end up with the fraction 7 over 10. Using what we've already done before, this can be written as 70 over 100, and this is equal to 70%. So 28 is 70% of 40. With this example in particular, you may have gone down a different route. You might want to pause the video and have a think about an alternative approach to finding 28 over 40 as a percentage. If I divided the numerator and the denominator by 2, I would have ended up with 14 over 20. Now, if I multiply the denominator by 5, I end up with something over 100. I therefore have to multiply the numerator by 5, and that gives us the answer 70. So we end up with 70 over 100, which is equal to 70%. Other types of questions you might need to be aware of are those where you're having to think about multiples of 25. And what I mean by this is when we create the fraction from the problem, the denominator of that fraction is 25, or a multiple of 25. Again, I'll show you what I mean. What is 7 as a percentage of 25? Again, let's write this as a fraction. We have 7 over 25. Well, we know that 25 goes into 104 times, so if I multiply the denominator by 4 to get 100, I have to multiply the numerator by 4, which is equal to 28. So 7 over 25 is equal to 28%. So 7 is 28% of 25. What is 36 as a percentage of 75? Again, we write this as a fraction, so that's 36 over 75. So we need to write this as something over 100. It's not so straightforward. So the approach that I would be using is, well, if I divide 75 by 3, I end up with 25, which means I have to divide the numerator by 3. And 36 divided by 3 is equal to 12. So I now have a fraction of 12 over 25, which we can now turn into a fraction out of 100 by multiplying the numerator and the denominator by 4. So we end up with 48 over 100, and this of course is 48%. So 36 is 48% of 75. What is 60 as a percentage of 75? Again, let's write this as a fraction. So we have 60 over 75, and we want to write this as something over 100. So what I would be doing is, if I divide 75 by 3, I get 25. I therefore have to divide the numerator by 3, which is 20. So I now have an equivalent fraction of 20 over 25. And if I multiply 25 by 4, I get 100. I therefore have to multiply the numerator, which is 20, and I multiply that by 4, and I end up with 80. So we then have a fraction of 80 over 100, which of course is 80%. So 60 is 80% of 75. And finally, what is 23 as a percentage of 25? Well, if we write this as a fraction, we've got 23 over 25. By multiplying the denominator by 4, I get 100. I therefore have to multiply the numerator by 4, and that gives us 92. So we have 92 over 100, which is 92%. So we can say that 23 is 92% of 25. Let's just do one more non-calculator question. At an event of 200 people, 96 were male. What percentage were female? So we have to do a little bit of a calculation first of all to work out how many who attended the event were female. Well, that's going to be 200 subtract 96, which is equal to 104. So 104 females were at the event. If we write this as a fraction, we end up with 104 over 200. You might wish to pause the video and think about what we're going to do now. Of course, if we look at the denominator, which is 200, if I divide this by 2, I get 100. So if I divide the denominator by 2, I have to divide the numerator by 2. 104 divided by 2 is equal to 52. So we end up with 52 over 100, which is 52%. So 52% of the people who attended the event were female. Let's look at using a calculator. So if you are in an exam situation or just in everyday life and you needed to quickly work out the percentage of something, it's very straightforward. What is 60 as a percentage of 75? Well, normally if we were doing this as a non-calculator question, we would have written it as 60 over 75. But typing this into a calculator, we can type this as 60 divided by 75. 60 divided by 75 is equal to 0.8. So that's the decimal equivalent of the fraction. But we need to write this as a percentage. So we now have to multiply this by 100. And this, of course, gives us the answer 80. So 60 is 80% of 75. What is 74 as a percentage of 80? Again, we would be thinking of this as a fraction, 74 over 80. So if we're writing this into our calculator, we would type this as 74 divided by 80. And this will give us a decimal equivalent of 0.925. We now have to convert this into a percentage by multiplying by 100. 0.925 multiplied by 100 is equal to 92.5%. So 74 is 92.5% of 80. Now, in all the above cases, we have been comparing the smaller number to the larger number. But that might not always be the case. So for example, what is 70 as a percentage of 40? We are comparing 70 to 40. And if we were writing this as a fraction, we'd end up with 70 over 40. So we need to write this as a fraction over 100. I'm going to divide top and bottom by 2. So I end up with 35 over 20. Well, if I multiply the denominator by 5, I end up with something over 100. That now means I have to multiply the numerator by 5. Now 35 multiplied by 5 might sound very complicated, but this is how I calculate it in my head. I know that I've got 30 multiplied by 5, which is equal to 150. I'm then going to add 5 multiplied by 5, which is 25. So 150 add 25 is 175. So I end up with 175 over 100, and that is 175%. Now, if I was doing this problem on a calculator, I would type in 70 divided by 40, which gives us a decimal equivalent of 1.75. I then multiply this by 100 to find the percentage equivalent, and that is 175. And finally, especially in calculator papers, you may be given something a little bit more complex, and you will be asked to give the answer to 1 or 2 decimal places. Now, I am going to cover this in more detail in an upcoming video, but let's introduce this idea with a couple of examples, and these will be the last 2 examples in this video. What is 230 litres as a percentage of 310 litres? Give your answer to 2 decimal places. So we're going to use a calculator to do this. Remember, we are trying to find 230 litres as a percentage of 310 litres. So we would be thinking of a fraction of 230 over 310. And we can write this in a calculator as 230 divided by 310. And then we multiply by 100, and we end up with 74.1935 and so on. It says give your answer to 2 decimal places. This means that we're going to have 2 digits after the decimal point. Well, here's the cutoff point. So we have 74.19. Now what I'm going to say here, I'm going to cover in more detail in the next video. So don't panic if you don't completely understand what I'm going to be saying next. Once we have found the cutoff point for 2 decimal places, we have to determine whether we round the second number after the decimal point up or whether we keep it the same. Now the second digit after the decimal point is this 9. So do we keep this 9 the same or do we round up? And this we do by looking at the first digit after the cutoff point. Now, if this first digit after the cutoff point is 4 or less, we keep the 9 the same. If this digit after the cutoff point is 5 or more, then we round this 9 up. We can see that this number after the cutoff point is 3, so we round down, and this 9 stays as 9. And we end up with 74.19% to 2 decimal places. Here's another question. Write 1.3 kilometres as a percentage of 740 metres. Give your answer to 1 decimal place. So the first thing you've probably noticed is that one of the values is given in kilometres, we have 1.3 kilometres, and the other value is given in metres, 740 metres. So to tackle this problem, we actually need to make sure that both values are in the same units. 1.3 kilometres is 1,300 metres. Remember that there are 1,000 metres in a kilometre. I will be doing more work on conversions in a later video. So we have 1,300 metres, and we're going to write this as a percentage of 740 metres. So I'm thinking of the fraction of 1,300 over 740. So I'm going to type this into my calculator, 1,300 divided by 740, and then I multiply by 100. And this gives us the answer 175.6756, and so on. I have to give this answer to one decimal place. So here's our cutoff point. So we're going to end up with 175 point something. The first digit after the decimal point is 6. But what we have to do is determine whether we keep this 6 the same or whether we have to round it up. And this we do by looking at the first digit after the cutoff point, which in this case is 7. Now, if this number is 4 or less, we round down. That is, we keep the 6 the same. If this digit is 5 or more, then we round up. Of course, 7 is 5 or more, so that means we now have to round the 6 up. And we round the 6 up to 7. So we end up with 175.7%. And there's our answer to one decimal place. As I mentioned before, in the next video I will be looking at rounding and decimal places, and we will come back to these two questions again in the next video once we looked a little bit more in detail about how to write numbers to one or two decimal places, and hopefully this will make a lot more sense. So that's all I'm going to be covering on percentages at this time. I hope you found them helpful, and thank you for watching.